Hello, folks. Thank you for tuning in to the Federalist Files. We're going to be going over Federalist number 33 today. It is titled The Same Subject Continued Concerning the General Power of Taxation, written by Alexander Hamilton, released January 2nd, 1788. Topics include Constitution as the supreme law of the land and the legislature's right to make laws in pursuance of their duty to the Constitution. So this one generally, in a general sense, the scope is, he points out, Hamilton, a couple clauses that are in the Constitution, and then he embodies the argument of his dissenters, and then he argues against them very reasonably. It's just a simple provision that's in there, but it seems like the dissenters of the proposed Constitution were so taken about by their own, I don't know if it was their own self-aggrandizement exactly. I mean, he states that every once in a while, or if they're just so fervent in their belief that the proposed Constitution would not work and it wouldn't prevail. I'm not really sure exactly what it is, but I'm going to read it off here. So in this paper, he defends the last clause of the 8th section of the first article of the proposed Constitution in relation to the legislature's power. It reads, and I quote, "To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers by that Constitution vested in the government of the United States or in any department of officer thereof." End quote. So it's very simple. It gives the federal legislature the power, the necessary and proper power to execute its own powers. It's really any law that is, the big word here that he uses is, or that's in the next clause, but he uses, at some point he uses the pursuance, as in any law that helps to empower the federal government and the powers that are already laid out in the Constitution. So any law that they see as necessary and proper for the execution of their powers. As in, the best way I could try to think of a example, I think he talks about a taxation example. So the federal government talks about exports and imports, but it does not actually lay out an apparatus or a system for how that is going to be done, or the officers that would be involved in the collection of the taxation. Now, if the federal government were to constitute a federal taxation collection service on imports and exports, that would be within their power, considering they're the only ones that are supposed to be able to tax imports and exports. That's the best way that I could really explain it. So Hamilton also defends the second clause of the 6th article, declaring, and I quote, "that the Constitution and the laws of the United States made in the pursuance thereof and the treaties made by their authority shall be the supreme law of the land. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." End quote. Here he's saying, once again, you can make laws in pursuance to carry out the powers of the Union. So if there's another way to put it militarily is this, once again, the Constitution lays out who's going to be the commander-in-chief of the military, and then the raising of the troops is really up to the legislative branch, how much it is allowed through them holding the purse through appropriation of funds. And since that is the federal government, if they were to pursue a federal law in order to empower the military further, that's something that would be legitimately within their power, considering the executive is the commander-in-chief and the legislative branch holds the purse for appropriating the funds. That's a simpler way of explaining it. Now, the treaties, yeah, everything is considered the supreme law of the land. Just to go over, he's already stated that before, above the states, but it is only the supreme law of the land as it relates to the powers that are laid out in the Constitution. Now, if the Constitution does not hold any provision in it to what the federal government's power over a state power, I'm trying to think of specific laws. To be stupid, there's a law, I think, in New Jersey that that I think it's the hair cutteries can't be open on Sunday, or barbers, by law in New Jersey, cannot be open on Sunday. So there's nothing federally that the federal government can do to change that law because they have no type of provision within their power, within their federal constitution, that would allow them to somehow change a state law in New Jersey. And this is something that, I mean, you really could fight over this because there's certain parts of the federal constitution that are not being followed in the states independently, and it is being allowed, and the federal government doesn't really do anything about it. In regards to the Second Amendment, that's being one of them. But I'm going to explain that later because there's an example in here that actually lines up perfectly with the Second Amendment. So in summation, these two clauses give the federal government the power to pass laws in pursuit of the execution of their constitutional powers, superseding any state constitutions that are contradictory to their powers that are laid out in the federal constitution. Now, Hamilton asserts that contenders have misrepresented these two clauses, claiming that they are very vaguely and broadly extend the powers almost infinitely. And then to that he explains, he states, and I quote, "These two clauses have been the source of much virulent invective and petulant declamation against the proposed Constitution. They have been held up to the people in all the exaggerated colors or misrepresentation as the pernicious engines by which their local governments were to be destroyed and their liberties exterminated," end quote. So he's just saying his dissenters are over-exaggerating. They are embellishing. They're making it like this is going to be an extension of the federal government that is eventually going to jeopardize the freedoms of the states as well as the people themselves. So then next he goes on to state, and I quote, "They are only declaratory of a truth which would have resulted by necessary and unavoidable implication from the very act of constituting a federal government and vesting it with certain specific powers. This is so clear a proposition that moderation itself can scarcely listen to the railings which have been so copiously vented against this part of the plan without emotions that disturb its equanimity." So the way that he's pretty much just going on the same, he's just saying everything here is really false, they're fallacious, and they're over-exaggerating it. This provision itself only vests the government to pass laws that gives a foundation or a stalwart to the specific powers that are laid out in the federal constitution. So then he continues, he states, and I quote, "What is a power but the ability or faculty of doing a thing? What is the ability to do a thing but the power of employing the means necessary to its execution? What is a legislative power but a power of making laws? What are the means to execute a legislative power but laws? What is the power of laying and collecting taxes but a legislative power, or a power of making laws to lay and collect taxes? What are the proper means of executing such a power but necessary and proper laws?" End quote. He has a very good point. He's I guess this is considered deductive reasoning. I'm not really sure of the two. I think there's deductive and then inductive or something like that. He's stating here that the legislative power is laid out in the Constitution, that they have the power of making laws. They also have the power to employ taxation, and they need the means in order to be able to employ this taxation power. And in order to do that, they have to make laws so then they can create the means to reach the end. So it's almost like the Constitution doesn't give an end necessarily, but it does set a foundational principle on what is supposed to be under the power of the legislative branch, just like the other two branches as well. But it also gives them the ability to make the powers to pursue, make the laws to pursue the obligation of being able to carry out that power that's given to them in the Constitution. And this is I know this becomes almost redundant, but I think the way in which he lays out his argument is very solid, and that is something that is seldom today in society. People being able to reason and come up with a solid argument. So here what he goes on to next, he states, and I quote, "His simple train of inquiry furnishes us at once with a test by which to judge of the true nature of the clause complained of. It conducts us to the palpable truth that a power to lay and collect taxes must be a power to pass all laws necessary and proper for the execution of that power." I think he's meant this simple train of inquiry. Yeah. So he's just, once again, he's saying it's obvious. And then he goes on, and he states, and I quote, "If there is anything exceptionable, it must be sought for in the specific powers upon which this general declaration is predicated. The declaration itself, though it may be chargeable with tautology or redundancy, is at least perfectly harmless," end quote. So he's saying, people, if you're going to look into the clause itself, he's saying it's redundant, it's tautological, meaning it's just repeating something that was before said, but using different words to say it, which he's right. That's exactly what this one's doing. It almost gives, and this is why I want to bring up the Second Amendment, it almost gives a second opinion on something, just to let people know for sure, hey, this is it. This is it. This is it's like stating in the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and then shall not be infringed at the very end. So it lays out almost the reason, so we need a well-regulated militia, and then the reason for it being necessary, it's necessary to the security of a free state, and it's the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and they need that right to keep and bear arms, and to have a well-regulated militia, which gives the security of which ensures the security of a free state, and it shall not be infringed at the very end. And that's almost to kind of accentuate it, to add extra emphasis to it. Now, that is something that's not really followed in our state constitutions, and our federal head could, if they wanted to, they could step in. And they think that there really is not an argument to be made that there should be, what's the exact word that I want to use? There should be not control on it, but there should be some sort of grasp or some sort of hold on Second Amendment rights. So the argument that you're going to get is, oh, well, you have the right to own a firearm in New Jersey. That's not the problem. The problem is in New Jersey it's the extra things. It's the magazines. There's certain firearms you can't buy here, but you can buy in other places, and that's kind of, to me, it seems like it's against the Second Amendment, because proportionally, if you think about us versus other states, they're able to have extra firearms ownership rights, whereas we're not. And then there's other citizens that are also privy to extra rights in this state, especially more than any other. That's another thing that's going on. I'm reading these articles saying that on I think January 17th, there's going to be state capitol protests, and then all these weird news stations, and they don't know what they're talking about. They're saying that the New Jersey State Police, they're expecting firearms owners to show up with their guns on these state capitals. I don't really know if that's going to end up happening. I don't think it will, just because it's an automatic felony in New Jersey, unless if you're open carrying a rifle, which I think actually is legal, just because there's nothing saying you can't do it. But you're definitely going to probably get arrested no matter what for it, and you have to fight it out in court. So that's not really worth it for a lot of gun owners. A lot of gun owners in New Jersey are of the understanding that there's already so much gun control, and the more that you do and the more you act out, the more gun control is coming down the pike to begin with. And then on top of that, that will add an extra emphasis for people to encourage it. Other citizens that don't really care about firearms ownership. Now, what he states next here, he states, and I quote, "The convention probably foresaw what it has been a principal aim of these papers to inculcate, that the danger which most threatens our political welfare is that the state governments will finally sap the foundations of the Union, and might therefore think it necessary in so cardinal a point to leave nothing to construction. Whatever may have been the inducement to it, the wisdom of the precaution is evident from the cry which has been raised against it, as that very cry betrays the disposition to question the great and essential truth which it is manifestly the object of that provision to declare." End quote. So interestingly enough, I think that he's saying that they're hitting the nail on the head. They're right with it. It's almost like when a conservative commentator comes out and the left goes after them and freaks out over whatever it is that they say. That pretty much means they're right on the money. He's saying he's right on the money because of the responses that he's getting from his dissenters. And then he's also, and this is very interesting. What he's saying here is, and what does he say? The wealth threatens our political welfare is that the state governments will finally sap the foundations of the Union and might therefore think it necessary in so cardinal a point to leave nothing to construction. So they're putting this, and it's exactly as I said before, they're putting this almost, it seems like it's a redundant clause in the Constitution, but it's not, because it's being used to give a extra safeguard or an extra defense against the state governments from being able to sap the money and the revenue from the Union. And he states there, and that's the most important part, he says, leave nothing to construction, which is very similar, like I said, to the Second Amendment at the very end, where they write, shall not be infringed, on the very, I guess you would call it, the last clause of the Second Amendment. And it has been infringed, obviously. So, so how well that has worked for us. Now, and this is an important quote here that he has next. He states, and I quote, "If the federal government should overpass the just bounds of its authority and make a tyrannical use of its powers, the people, whose creature it is, must appeal to the standard they have formed and take such measures to redress the injury done to the Constitution as the exigency may suggest and prudence justify. The propriety of a law in a constitutional light must always be determined by the nature of the powers upon which it is found. Suppose by some forced constructions to its authority, which indeed cannot be easily imagined, the federal legislature should attempt to vary the law of descent in any state, would it not be evident that in making such an attempt it had exceeded its jurisdiction and infringed upon that of the state?" End quote. So probably the most important thing to take from this quote here is he talks about, and I think it's pretty cool, he talks about tyrannical powers of the government, the federal government. He goes, the people whose creature it is, as in the people created the federal government and its self-government structures, self-government system that we have here, something that's never been done before. And then on top of that, he goes on to say, now, if the federal government is going to make laws and they're going to, the way in which they act with some sort of power that is going to usurp and infringe upon the state, then it really is not a power. And it is, and they are exceeding their jurisdiction. It's almost like when it's invalid. It's almost like when the state goes through with an executive order in New Jersey telling you to wear masks and comply, and that's not really a law. And by the constitutional grounds, it's not a law. It's just something that was made executive power. It's almost like a mandate, something maybe you should follow. It's not something that really is, like, if you get caught not wearing a mask, I don't know if they really actually can charge you with anything in this state. I think, yeah, you'll have to go through the court system, but you should be able to win as long as the only thing that they were going to charge you for is not wearing a mask. Now, it goes on, and I quote, "Suppose again that upon the pretense of an interference with its revenues, it should undertake to abrogate a land tax imposed by the authority of a state, would it not be equally evident that this was an invasion of that concurrent jurisdiction in respect to the species of tax which its constitution plainly supposes to exist in the state governments?" End quote. So he's giving the example, if the federal government's now laid down a land tax, the federal government, if they laid down a land tax that's supposed to be by the Constitution imposed by the authority of a state, would it not be equally evident that this is an invasion of the concurrent jurisdiction in the respect of the species of taxation? Thus, it would be null and void if they were to try to do that constitutionally. And it goes on. he states, and I quote, "If there ever should be a doubt on this head, the credit of it will be entirely due to those reasoners who, in the imprudent zeal of their animosity to the plan of the convention, have labored to envelop it in a cloud calculated to obscure the plainest and simplest truths." End quote. So here he's just ripping his dissenters apart, saying that they have so much enthusiasm that it's so imprudent, meaning it is not careful. It's reckless enthusiasm and animosity that they have towards the plan. They've labored to envelope it in a cloud calculated to obscure the plainest and simplest truths. They're pretty much lying about what the actual provisions and the clauses say in the Constitution, and that's what he's saying, to obscure the plainest and simplest truths, that they've almost been enraged. It's actually very similar to today in politics, is they've been so enraged by the idea of the proposed Constitution. It's almost like Trump derangement syndrome, where they've just lost their mind and they've lost any semblance of reason and simple truths, which is very similar and relative to what's going on today. So Hamilton mentions states undertaking the land tax, but not the federal government. Hamilton declares the Constitution must be law of the land as an example to prove that the power of the federal legislature isn't tyrannical. Now, Hamilton next, he suggests, and I quote, "A law, by the very meaning of the term, includes supremacy. It is a rule which those to whom it is prescribed are bound to observe. This results from every political association. If individuals enter into a state of society, the laws of that society must be the supreme regulator of their conduct. If a number of political societies enter into a larger political society, the laws which the latter may enact pursuant to the powers entrusted to it by its constitution must necessarily be supreme over those societies and the individuals of whom they are composed." End quote. So here he's really the symbolism of what a law really is. It's something that's supposed to be, well, in the first place, it was agreed upon by the people themselves to create a law a lot of the time, not all of the time. Whoever it is that you elect as your state legislature or as your federal government officials, elected officials, they're supposed to prescribe the laws, and you're supposed to be bound to observe those laws, and it's supposed to be representative of the people. That's the point in having the self-government. And it says this results from every political association, pretty much every government, the law always is supreme, because without the theory here, and I've also heard very, very interesting arguments from, I think his name's Michael Malice. He's an anarchist. He's pretty intellectual in the way he explains things, but I think I want to say he's from some country right next to Russia. Maybe it was Czechoslovakia or something like that. But he's an anarchist, and he explains how all laws are bad, pretty much. And it's very his take is very, very interesting. But now, these laws are supposed to be supreme. If you don't have laws, then you really don't have a society, because then you can have complete anarchy. That's the theory that's going on here. But Michael Malice would have a totally different theory. He would think that any type of government authority is not good, and if people were able to live on their own without government around, then they'd be much better off. Which I don't really, I understand the sentiment in a way, but I'd just be much more aimed towards having just a smaller, trying to downsize the government as much as we can. And I don't even know if it's really downsize the government. Yeah, downsize the government in certain respects. Militarily, no, but in bureaucracy, yes, and in taxation, in amount of money in the budget, yes, as well. Now, in other words, the use of the term supremacy is a means to define the power of the law. That law shall be supreme in order to carry out responsibilities listed in the Constitution. For example, the federal government has the responsibility, along with the states, to protect life and liberty. In the case where an individual wants to burn down a house and partake in depredations, the government has a responsibility to protect that property. The provision of supremacy is an attempt to deter that individual from burning down your house, and ensuring that if they do so, justice will be served and there will be consequences for not following the laws of the society. This supremacy of the law is in pursuance to protect the individual's rights of law-abiding citizens, as well as to aid in the goal of the government to carry out its responsibilities. So that's why it's kind of weird when you have the idea of anarchy, because then there's no answer when someone is to go and take something from somebody else. That's why it's kind of it's really, it might be mob rule if I could think about it, because whoever can gain the most amount of power. I'm just trying to think what we had in America before there was a government. We had a bunch of individual Native American tribes, and they fought and killed each other like crazy. So I just don't really know. And then even in the older world, in almost all the older recorded world, everyone was always killing each other, and there's always some sort of ruler. So I just don't know. I mean, I think the government, what we have here, is the best setup, and people in America like to complain about the government. It's more the government officials. That's why it's weird when we get the big, like, liberal progressive idea now is to say the Constitution needs to be changed, or they need to get rid of it and write a new one. And usually that is always coming from people that have actually never read the Constitution before, and that's not surprising. But that's the idea of the liberal progressive class. They know nothing about the Constitution. They know nothing about... They have... I mean, I know this myself because I used to be a liberal. So I know myself that I would say things I would say the same thing, and I've actually never read the Constitution before at that time when I would say it. And then once I actually read the Constitution, I realized that mostly it was just a document for governing. And then the very end in the Bill of Rights was actually individual rights endowed by your creator, certain rights that protected you from government overreach. But once you look at it, it's just funny because it's mostly procedural in a lot of ways. If you read through the Constitution, I just don't understand how you can read through it and say, I think this thing needs to be destroyed and we need to create another one. Now, if you think there's certain parts that actually need to be amended, that's a whole different case. Now, the new left class of people that are my age generally don't believe in the Bill of Rights. They don't believe in the First Amendment, especially right now. It seems like there's no one speaking up from the liberal class, from the progressive left-wing class. They do not care. And their argument's been very weird. It's been like, oh, well, that's a private business. They can do whatever you want. You guys like private businesses, which isn't true because they're subverting. The government is using these private industries as proxies for their power, in essence, thus violating the First Amendment, because it's only going, if you haven't noticed, it's only going one side right now. It's persecution of all Republicans or all conservatives, and the left is free. Not only is it persecution of conservatives, and the left is free, it's also like legitimate terrorist leaders. The Ayatollah of Iran is free. There's that picture of Kathy Griffin holding up Trump's head, bloodied up. That's still allowed on Twitter. So it doesn't really the rules of Twitter are applying differently depending on what your political creed is, which is not a fair society. And another thing is, and I've stated this before, is that they are treating platforms. They're giving these platforms that are now acting as publishers, they're giving them the federal government security, a blanket of security, as if they're not publishers, they are platforms. Now, the reason they came out with Section 230 to begin with was for liability. They didn't want people suing these platforms just because certain people were saying mean things to them on the platforms. They didn't want them to be liable, and that was the reason, because they didn't expect Twitter or Facebook, they didn't expect any of these agents, any of these companies to be able to take off things that were derogatory or violations, or things that were inciting violence or threatening violence. They weren't expecting them to be that effective, because the scope of how many people are on these social media platforms it's immeasurable. So they came out with Section 230 to protect them, but they were considered platforms. Now they're almost in the publisher class. So the things that they do make them a publisher. And if the New York Times was doing what they're doing right now, the New York Times would be out of business because everyone would sue them. So Section 230, in my humble opinion, is everything's contradictory right now because the platforms really are not platforms. They're no longer platforms. There now should be substituted the name of publisher, and then they should have to follow the same rules as the New York Times, the New York Post, the Washington Post. But so what I have next here is he's talking about pursuant. Okay, so now next he states, let's see, where am I here? Okay, next he states, and I quote, but it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies will become the supreme law of the land. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Hence we perceive that the clause which declares the supremacy of the laws of the Union, like the one we have just before considered, only declares a truth which flows immediately and necessarily from the institution of a federal government. End quote. So he's saying laws that are not pursuant to constitutional powers that the federal government tries to push down your throat is considered an act of usurpation, and it really should not be. It should be treated as such, which is funny. It's just funny because it's like the Second Amendment, the shall not be infringed clause at the very end. It's almost like we should not follow any gun control that goes on in New Jersey in terms of magazine limits, things like that. You should just say, oh, well, screw you guys. I'm just going to do what I want to do. According to this, according to the Federalist Papers, I should do what I'm going to do as long as it's following the Constitution. So next he states, and I quote, hence we perceive that the clause which declares the supremacy of the laws of the Union, like the one we have just before considered, only declares a truth which flows immediately and necessarily from the institution of a federal government. It will not, I presume, have escaped observation that it expressly confines this supremacy to laws made pursuant to the Constitution. End quote. So he's really just going hard on this one premise. It is all laws. They have the power to pass laws that are pursuant to the Constitution, that follow the constitutionality, to help different branches carry out their constitutional obligation. Now, Hamilton concludes that the federal government doesn't have the authority to impact the taxation of states, with the exception of taxation on imports and exports. If this were the case, Hamilton believed that the people would vehemently oppose this provision and battle in order to change this usurpation of power. He states, and I quote, though a law therefore laying a tax for the use of the United States would be supreme in its nature, and could not legally be opposed or controlled, yet a law for abrogating or preventing the collection of a tax laid by the authority of the state, unless upon imports and exports, would not be the supreme law of the land, but a usurpation of power not granted by the Constitution. End quote. So he's saying, to begin with, there should be some sort of concurrent jurisdiction. There should be some sort of concurrent power of taxation, taxing certain things in the United States from the federal government side. In nature, it could not legally be opposed or controlled, so they do have that power to tax, but coming out now with a claim that the states could not tax would be something that does not follow the supreme law of the land or the Constitution. So that's a usurpation of power. And the whole thing is, yeah, the federal government can constitute it. It is up to the people themselves to go against the grain, if the Supreme Court doesn't rule it unconstitutional and our legislators pass it all through law, or if our president doesn't veto the bill. So next, what he states, and I quote, as far as an improper accumulation of taxes on the same object might tend to render the collection difficult or precarious, this would be a mutual inconvenience not arising from a superiority or defect of power on either side, but from an injudicious exercise of power by one or the other, in a manner equally disadvantageous to both. It is to be hoped and presumed, however, that mutual interest would dictate a concert in this respect, which would avoid any material inconvenience. End quote. Here he's just saying, I think he said this in the last paper too. He's talking about the concurrent power of taxation, though it may actually work as a defect of having power on either side, just because it's going to be injudicious in its exercise, because you can have, if you have the state and the federal government both taxing the same object at a high rate, it'll be injudicious, but it'll be that way for both the powers, which actually kind of makes it fair, and that's what keeps certain taxes lower, and it keeps it fair between the state government and the federal government. That's the whole point of that. Now, he ends this paper, he states, and I quote, "The inference from the whole is that the individual states would, under the proposed constitution, retain an independent and uncontrollable authority to raise revenue to any extent of which they may stand in need by every kind of taxation except duties on imports and exports." End quote. So really, there's nothing, the whole point of these last, just to kind of wrap everything up, the whole point of these last couple papers has been Hamilton arguing with his dissenters on the power that's being given to the federal government is not going to usurp, it's not going to overpower that of the state, because they're going to be able to raise revenues with the exception of imports and exports. But they have uncontrollable taxation powers. They're independent from the federal government, and it's also a safeguard because the federal government can tax too, but the federal government can't stop them from taxing. There's nothing in the federal constitution saying they can do so. So you're not going to have a huge federal government that's way stronger than the states and is going to oppress the states. That's his core argument here. And anything that's going to be passed by the federal government, any laws, they're all going to be pursuant of the power of the federal government. They're not going to go outside of the scope of what the federal government does. Now, in practice, do they currently do that? Right now, in current days, the federal government, I would say, does usurp their power, but I think the state government also usurps their power too. So it's a slippery slope. It takes one to know one, I guess. So that'll be it. That'll be it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone tuning in. Make sure you check out the weekend special. Should be coming out early Sunday morning. I usually work hard on it into the night, depending on how long it is, doing the editing, putting it up, and everything. But usually it's early Sunday morning. And I'm pre-recording this early, so we're going to see what happens over this week. I'll also have one in the one that just happened yesterday as well. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Make sure you drop the mic. Please like, share, and subscribe. I will see everybody this weekend. Thank you.